We are in the Gospel of Luke, as you know. If you've been here for any length of time, for the last few months at least, you'll know we're in the Gospel of Luke. And you'll remember, I think, that at the beginning part, not the infancy narratives that we did over Advent and Christmas, but as we got into the life of Jesus, one of the things that he did was he went into the Nazareth synagogue and he unrolled the scroll of Isaiah and he preached from it, or he read from it at least, and he said, this has been fulfilled in your hearing. And one of the things that he said is, I've come to give good news to the poor. And we described what the poor actually means, and it's not just people that don't have a lot of money, it's actually really all of us, really. And we sang about that in that last song. We were singing about the orphan and the outsider. We sang about the poor coming to Jesus and what good news this gospel was. And so last week, we saw lepers being healed. And I talked to you briefly as well. We didn't really go into it, but I talked to you about tax collectors being welcomed, women being healed and given dignity, the outsider being called in, and so on. What we have on this journey south that Jesus is doing with his disciples is that we actually have Jesus practicing what he's just preached. So he is calling the outsider, the sinner, the poor, and these interactions and these gospel outworkings that we're seeing. Last week I called them banquets with sinners. Now, he wasn't actually banqueting with them. He wasn't literally sitting down at tables with them. But the idea was that he was interacting with them, and it was like he was feasting with them. And he was having a banquet with people who aren't usually invited to big functions. And that is part of the beauty of the gospel, the hope for those who live with little or no hope. And in the background, of course, is this idea of the great eschatological banquet called the marriage supper of the Lamb. That was a big word, end times banquet that's to come, the marriage supper of the Lamb. And that kind of lurks in the background. But the thing is, not everybody is happy at the party. Luke records a few dinner conversations. Now, these ones are actually dinner conversations, banquets, actual banquets that he has with religious leaders, with Pharisees, with teachers of the law. And these people are not happy with what they're seeing and hearing. And so these meals become places of confrontation that Jesus has and dispute. And he ends up going on the offensive, and he confronts the pride and hypocrisy of those people who are supposed to be looked up to as spiritual leaders for the nation of Israel. And they're failing, according to Jesus. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at one of those today. There's more than one, but we're only going to look at one of them today. So if you have a Bible with you, open to Luke chapter 11. It'll be on the screen for you as well. And we're starting at verse 37, if you like to follow along on your phone or in your Bible. So this is what Luke 11, 37 to 52 says. While he was speaking, a Pharisee invited him to come and dine with him, so he went in and took his place at the table. The Pharisee was amazed, and by amazed, maybe astonished, is a better way to describe it. It's not amazed like, this is so great. It's more, he's kind of astonished. He was amazed that he did not first wash before dinner. Then the Lord said to him, now you Pharisees, you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. You fools, he says. Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? So give alms. Alms is ALMS. It's like giving charity, giving money to a charitable cause. Give alms, he says, to the things that are within, and see, everything will be made clean for you. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and herbs of all kinds, and neglect the justice and the love of God. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love to have the seat of honor in the synagogues and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. Woe to you, you're like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without even realizing it. One of the lawyers answered him, and maybe in your version it says scribes or teachers of the law or something like that, same person, same kind of person. He answered him, he says, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us as well." And essentially Jesus says, "Okay, well, if you want to get in on this, then welcome to the conversation." And he says, "Woe also to you lawyers, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not lift a finger to ease them. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your ancestors killed, so you're witnesses and approve of the deeds of your ancestors, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that this generation may be charged with the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be charged against this generation. Woe to you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you've hindered those who are entering." God's word to us today. We see a bit of a different side of Jesus there, don't we? We see a bit of a different side. And so we're going to talk a bit about that this morning. I want you to imagine for me that you've just cooked a really nice dinner. And so maybe you've cooked a nice dinner for your family, or maybe you're having some friends over or something like that. And so you've cooked this nice meal, and you've all sat down at the table, and you've enjoyed it. And then you go back into the kitchen, and it's usually a bit of a mess, right? Now, maybe you're one of those people who cleans as they go, one of you wonderfully blessed people that clean as they go. Maybe that's you, but still, even if that's the case, you're going to go in and there's a certain amount of cleaning that needs to be done, right? So there's going to be plates and cutlery from the table that are going to need to be stacked in the dishwasher and so on. But there's always some things that either don't fit in the dishwasher or they shouldn't really go in there. And so there's always stuff you have to wash by hand. So I want you to imagine then you have this big pot that you've cooked some kind of sauce in. I'm sorry about the image. It's quite gross, isn't it? Brenda complained when she put it onto this. She said, "Jamie, why are you using this one?" I was like, well, it's going to make the point. So imagine you have this big pot, and maybe you've cooked some sauce in it, or that looks like some kind of, I don't know, pumpkin muffin or something, or whatever you want to call that. And so you've cooked in some kind of pot, and you fill the sink with soapy water, and you're about to wash it, and maybe one of your family members comes in and says, hey, I'd love to wash it for you. I don't know what that experience is like. Did I say that out loud? But imagine you had a family member come and say they want to wash the pot for you. And so you then, get a cloth. Maybe you go and do something else. You wipe down the counters or something. You're having a nice conversation as you clean up. But then you look over and the person from the family or your friend or whatever who's cleaning it, instead of putting it in the soapy water and like cleaning it out and maybe getting a scrubby if there's something burnt on the bottom, they get the cloth, they dip it in, and they just wipe the outside and the bottom, and then they dry it, and then they put it away in the cupboard. I mean, that would be gross. That would be absolutely filthy. And you'd be astonished that they were doing that. And you think, well, no one's going to be able to use that pot again, and if they do, it's going to be moldy, and you might get sick, and all those kind of things. Well, that's the picture we should have in our head when Jesus goes on the offensive. You Pharisees, he said, you clean the outside of the cup, you clean the outside of the dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. Inside you're filthy. You are attending to the outer cleanliness, but you're paying no attention to the inner world, and it's like washing a pot, but only cleaning the outside and then putting it away in the cupboard. So Jesus, on his journey south, is teaching. And while he's teaching, a Pharisee comes to him. If you read the little bit before that in Luke's gospel, Jesus has just used one of his great images. And the image is of, nobody goes and lights, lights a lamp and then puts a bowl on top of it. You don't do that. You light it and you put it on a lampstand. It gives light to the whole room. Like, people are familiar with that. He just finishes teaching that, and while he's teaching, a Pharisee comes up and says, hey, Jesus, come to my house for dinner. And so he does. He goes and he takes his seat at the table, and they begin to eat together. As he's teaching, the crowd was getting bigger. Verse 29 actually says that the crowd was increasing in size. So he invites him over. And then in verse 38, it says this: the Pharisee was amazed, and I changed that to astonished to help you understand what the amazement kind of was, that he did not first wash before dinner. And I don't know about you, but we can stop there and say, well, that's weird. What's that about? Was Jesus, the Son of God, unhygienic? Did he not wash his hands before dinner? If Mary was there, would she have been like, oh, Jesus, I can't take you anywhere. I taught you to wash your hands before dinner. What are you doing? No, of course not. It's not about hygiene. It's not about bacteria and potential sickness. It's not about any of those things. It's actually about cultural custom. And if you're wondering how I know that, well, we're going to go to Mark's gospel just for a moment. I'm just going to read a few verses for you, because it's not the same interaction. It's a different interaction, but there's some commentary that explains some stuff for us. So Mark 7, 1-4 says this: now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands. So it's not about hygiene, it's about being defiled. They ate with some defiled hands. That is without washing them. And then in verse 3 and 4, it's this bracketed out section, and it's like the author of Mark. So Mark is giving us a little bit of explanation just for those people who don't know the Jewish rituals. For you Gentiles who maybe aren't familiar, I'm going to give you a little bit of commentary. And he does. In brackets, he says this: for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. There it is. So this is about the tradition of the elders. They do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it first. And there are also many other traditions that they observe: the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So this has got nothing to do with hygiene and everything to do with the tradition of the elders, the rules, the cultural custom, the things that were proper and supposed to be done. They were scrupulous in washing their hands and washing items from the marketplace because of supposed defilement. This was about ritual purity. At the marketplace, the food that they bought may have been handled by Gentiles or other people considered part of the poor that we're talking about. And the Jewish people honestly believed that if we don't wash this, we might become defiled because they've touched it. That's what they were doing. And there are requirements in the Old Testament for washing, but it's usually related to the temple. It's usually related to the way that they ritually wash things that are to be used in the functioning of the temple for the purposes of worship. But there was never anything, there is nothing in the Old Testament about these kind of things, like if a Gentile touches something, you probably should wash it. Those just don't exist. They're not in there. So actually, it comes from the tradition of the elders, which means they've added all kinds of laws and rules and regulations and so on as a way of setting themselves apart, because on the outside, they want to appear all pure and ritually clean and so on. It is classic holier-than-thou activity. And Jesus perceives that the guy has a problem, that Jesus has not done this. And so that's what prompts him to respond the way he did. This is where we use the image of the wash pot. You Pharisees make all kinds of precautions for ritual purity. You've developed these rules that have gone far beyond the law of Moses. And what you've done is created this legalistic religiosity, and it is fundamentally flawed and wrong. Your outside may appear really, really clean, but on the inside, you're like a pot that was never submerged in the soapy water and cleaned properly. Your condition is actually deeply ironic. You are so concerned with cleanliness, but you're anything but that, is what he's saying. So he raises a question. He says, didn't God create the inside as well as the outside? Well, God is concerned with both. In fact, he's especially concerned with the inside. Elsewhere, Jesus says that out of the heart, the mouth speaks. In other words, what comes out of your mouth actually reveals what's truly going on the inside, your honesty, integrity, morality, purity, and so on. It's similar to saying the eyes are the window to the soul. That actually you can often tell a lot about somebody through their eyes. Now, I'm going to tell you something that has happened to me a number of times. I've actually met people before who I've never met, they're brand new to me. I've never met them before, but I've met them before now. And I've looked in their eyes, and I've known that they're believers. And I've asked them, and they've said, absolutely. I can tell by looking in their eyes. Maybe you've had that experience as well. Now, it can't always be that kind of, isn't always the case. Don't go around saying that to everybody you meet, because you might get some wrong. It might be that they just really like you. But sometimes you look in their eyes and you know that it is a window to the soul. You can sometimes tell through somebody's eyes. There's a kindness and there's a joy and an aliveness there. So, the inner world, your inside, your soul, is actually profoundly important. Work harder at keeping that clean, and then you can put your pot in the cupboard. That's what he's saying. So then he uses this metaphor and this custom of giving alms to the poor. Now, I don't know if that was a bit confusing to you. I think the first time I ever read it, I was like, what does that mean? What do you mean give charity to your heart? What do you mean give money, like giving alms to your heart? What does he mean by that? I think what he means is that Jesus is saying, give attention and pay attention to what's inside. Give the same energy to what's inside as you might give to something that's outside. Because a person may give money to the poor, money to charity, which is an external act of kindness and generosity. It's an honorable religious act. So give the same attention to your inner world as well. It's like attend to your inner world like you attend to your outer world. And I think that's what he's saying. And so then he goes on to give a couple of woes. And he sounds a little bit like an Old Testament prophet. And so what I want to do is just pop that up on the shelf for a minute. We'll come back to that. Jesus as Old Testament prophet is important. We'll come back to it. But he says, woe to you Pharisees, because you tithe mint and rue and other herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. In other words, you take tithing to the nth degree. If you have a mint plant and it's in your kitchen window and there's 10 mint leaves on it, you'll take one of them off and make sure you tithe it. Like he's making a point that this is ridiculous. Tithe, yes, but just be really, really generous. Don't turn it into a religious activity that borders on the ridiculous. Don't turn it into something that you become obsessed with. You become obsessed with these legalistic activities and these tiny little acts of legalistic religion that derives from this sense of pride and superiority and religious set-apartness. Look at what we do. I even tithe my mint plant. And yet you miss justice and the love of God. See how it's outward. They're doing something outward. Look what I do. But they're missing like the center of the gospel. We sang about the love of God today. There's something really, really wrong with that picture. He then gives a second woe. Woe to you Pharisees, because you take the best seats at the synagogue and you love to be greeted in the marketplace. You love it when people come up to you in the marketplace and they greet you, hello, Rabbi. Like you love that. He's coming after them for their pride and their self-serving religion. They want to be recognized as important and holy and so on. So seeking after attention and wanting to be honored by having the best seats, wanting to be recognized in front of everyone leads to this elitist mentality rather than this commitment to serve. which is what a religious leader is supposed to do, is supposed to serve. At this point, one of the lawyers pops up, and I think maybe probably wishes he hadn't. They're sometimes called experts in the law, scribes or whatever. Essentially, they're sort of officials. The Pharisee party were not officials. They were kind of like a lay group, but the scribes, teachers of the law, the lawyers, they were like more of an official group that officially interpreted the laws and wrote laws and explained the laws and so on. And so one of them pops up and says, hey, when you get after the Pharisees, you insult us as well. And I think he wishes he hadn't spoke, because then Jesus turns on him and says, well, woe to you as well. Because you just burden people with all these laws and regulations and traditions, but you do nothing to lift any kind of burden in the person's life. It's like telling someone they're wrong in all of these ways and not helping them know what is right, or how you can solve the issue, or whatever it is. And so the classic example is Sabbath laws being piled upon people to the point that, and Jesus has kind of an interaction, meaning that, no work of compassion can happen on the Sabbath because it's work. So if you lift a finger or you try to help someone, you're working, and you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And so actually what you're doing is you're breaking the law. And Jesus says that's garbage, because he has no time for that. Because he said, actually, what is better to do on the Sabbath? It's not in our passage, it's another passage. What is better to do on the Sabbath, bring life or bring death? To do good or do evil? If, quote unquote, working, liberates somebody from great pain and it shows compassion, then the kingdom has come. But if I say, I'm sorry, I can't lift a hand to help you on the Sabbath, you're going to have to get yourself up off the floor, that is, the kingdom has not come. And so Jesus goes after that. Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. I think that's a pretty profound thing that he said. We were not made to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for us, to actually teach us to have rhythm, to teach us to rest, to draw us into worship on a regular basis. God, it's like the owner's manual for human beings. Sabbath is important. We need to rest. The condemnation then gets even more serious when he connects their religiosity with treatment of the prophets, and including prophets and apostles that were to come, by treating them the way that they do. And John the Baptist would be a classic example. He was treated really poorly. By treating them that, they actually become culpable in the same way that their forefathers were culpable for killing the prophets. And he says it's like you build their tombs. And he mentions Abel. He says Abel to Zechariah. Well, Abel was the first one ever killed in the scriptures in the book of Genesis. And Zechariah was the last one recorded for us in 2 Chronicles chapter 24 was the last one. It's like all of them in the Old Testament, everyone that was killed, you're culpable for their deaths. And the fascinating one about this is that Zechariah was not killed in some back alley of Jerusalem and then hidden. He wasn't dumped in a dumpster or something. He was right out in the open. In fact, it was in Israel's holiest place. They killed him in the courtyard of the temple, the place where they worship. It says he was killed between the sanctuary and the altar. The sanctuary is the holy place that only the priests could go. Well, outside of that, in the courtyard, was the brazen altar, and he was killed between those two things. The brazen altar was the place where people came and confessed their sin, where they came and brought offerings for their sin. And it's there that they murdered him, killing him, breaking the commandment not to kill, right next to the altar where they're supposed to be dealing with sin, all because he was calling them out for sinning and being in disobedience. So you can't write this stuff. It's awful. Can't make this up. So I mentioned earlier, remember we put on the shelf, we put Jesus as Old Testament prophet on the shelf. Well, this is why. It's important because, as the passage says, the prophets of old were put to death for doing things like Jesus was doing, for bringing woe oracles, and they were all put to death. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen to Jesus. He's going to be put to death because he came against empire, Rome, but he really came against religiosity. It was Pilate who put him to death, but Pilate was reluctant. It was the religious establishment. You may recall one of the beasts of Revelation that we talked about that kind of works in and through religion, actually. And so it was the enemy that was working through him, and he was killed for it. So have they learned anything from their forefathers? Apparently not. And this generation, therefore, you're going to be culpable for all of it because you're going to put to death the greatest prophet that ever lived. Back in Deuteronomy, Moses said in Deuteronomy 18, he prophesied that a prophet like me will be raised up from among you. Listen to him. That prophet like me is indeed Jesus Christ. Do you remember when we're talking about the transfiguration, how he talked about he went up on the mountain and had a new Sinai-type experience as a new Moses leading a second Exodus? This is the prophet like me. So he's being an Old Testament prophet in this situation, bringing his woes, and he's going to be put to death for it, just like they were. And so this generation, you're culpable for all of it. So let's take a minute or two to talk about Jesus' tone, because sometimes we find it maybe a little bit difficult. Jesus was not mincing words. He even sounded a bit harsh. I mean, they said, you're insulting us, and he doesn't apologize. So he just insulted people, but he doesn't apologize for it. So what do we do with that? Well, not only does he not apologize, but actually he doubles down, and he gives a woe to the person who's saying, you just insulted us. So what do we do with Jesus' response? I think the first thing we have to say is Jesus was out in the open and just being honest. Like, he spent a lot of time with these people. They'd had opportunity to change. When they spoke about him, they did it behind his back. They gossiped and they plotted. He's right out there in the open. He's being honest. He's not sneaking around. He's saying it like it is. So he's being honest. He's not doing anything wrong in that sense. But why is he so hard on them? Well, I think it's captured for us at the end of the passage. I think that's why he's doing it. At the end of the passage, the final woe that comes to the lawyers, it says, essentially, you lawyers are actually well educated and trained. You know the law. You know the scriptures. You know what the prophets say. You have the knowledge. And you're the leaders. And he describes it as a key. You've got the key, he says. You've got the key to all of this, but you've chosen not to use the key, and so you yourselves haven't entered. But even worse than that, you've actually developed a rival religious system, and you've taught it, and you've insisted on it, and you've profited off of it. So not only do you not enter the truth, but you've stopped other people from entering it also. And you're meant to be the religious leaders, the people that Israel is supposed to look up to you and learn the law from you and trust you to interpret it for them and teach them how to live and follow Torah. You're an obstacle now in the spiritual well-being of others. Therefore, you are dangerous. And I think that's why Jesus comes after them, because they are unwittingly a tool of the enemy that is keeping people ensnared and trapped and imprisoned and so on. And that is why Jesus speaks harshly, because there's just too much at stake. So, as Jesus and the disciples make their journey south to the holy city of Jerusalem, they had all these interactions and banquets with sinners, and they welcomed them. And you remember how the poor were flocking to them? And then he has these interactions, these other banquets. He's having these interactions with the Pharisees. And so we've just looked at one in Luke 14. And he talks about healing of the Sabbath. He has another kind of interaction there. And you may remember a while ago in the series, I told you that there's this growing hostility And it's going to come to a head in the city of Jerusalem that they're walking towards. And so we have these comparison sections. We have these starkly different responses to Jesus' declaration that the kingdom is at hand. The poor receive it as good news. The religious leaders try to block it and criticize it and feel threatened by it. And last week I connected that to the parable of the lost son in chapter 15. You may remember that. We're talking about the younger son who comes to the father in repentance and humility, always the entry point to the kingdom. And you had the oldest son who gets angry and folds his arms and so on. And so I think that in some way kind of captures this in Luke. But what do we do with a passage like this today? What is the application for you and I? As I said, it's a pretty harsh word from Jesus. What do we do? Well, I think there's a couple of things at least. The first one I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to give you an application which is kind of the opposite of what I've just preached. And then I'm going to give you the application for what I just preached, and you'll see why. One of the things we have to be very, 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 very careful that we don't do, because humans don't do this very well. We have a tendency in many things to pendulum swing. We have an experience over here, and so we swing all the way over here. We find it really hard to just correct. We always swing from extreme to extreme. We find it hard to live here. And so one of the things we do not want to do, and I don't want you to get from this message, is it would be easy to so vehemently want to throw off any kind of Pharisaic legalism to weed out anything that could be seen as legalistic or judgmental, all those kind of things, that we end up swinging to the other side where we start to tolerate sin in our lives. And we refuse to embrace any kind of theology of discipleship or seeking holiness or growing in Christ-likeness and so on. That's a very real danger as we move away from legalism. And there are Christians, many, who do this, who allow their life and their spiritual praxis to be shaped more by fallen, broken Western Canadian culture than actually the directives of Scripture and the traditional teaching of the church through the ages and good theology and so on. There are Christians who actually think, well, like I love Jesus, but some of this stuff in here is, some of this stuff in here is kind of a bit outdated, right? Like we don't really need to live up to all of this kind of stuff, and we're not really gonna, teach our children to live up to some of these things because, surely not. No one does that, right? And so we start to tolerate sin, and we start to be influenced by Canadian culture around us, which is not a good thing to do. Not everything is bad about it, but in terms of our morality and so on. And so we can swing too far, and what those Christians do is actually they devastate their own souls. And it's apparent, you see it. That's the last thing we want to do. We don't want to swing to that direction. However, in line with the message today, we also cannot allow ourselves to harbor legalistic tendencies. That's very easy to do, especially for those of us, I put myself in that as well. If there's a particular, sin that you've come out of or a lifestyle that you've come out of, you can actually become more harsh to people who are in that lifestyle still, and you don't give them the same grace that you gave, because actually what you're doing is really, you're talking to your old self. You see your old self, and you're actually trying to weed out the flesh in yourself, and so you actually don't give them the grace that you received, and it's almost like you're pointing the finger at your old self, right? And that's a real danger. And then actually all we do is turn those people away. And that's the last thing we want to do. So we have to find a balance. We have to find and allow the pendulum to actually stop in the middle. And you might say, that's very, very hard. And I'll say, yes, it is. It is very hard. We have to find balance somehow. I think it's supposed to be hard. And the reason I think it's supposed to be hard is because if it was easy, we wouldn't need God as much. We could do it ourselves. God calls us to draw on his strength. And so the spiritual life is a journey you and I will be on for the rest of our lives, and we will mess it up, and we'll never be perfected this side of eternity, but we can get closer. That's growing in Christ-likeness as we are committed to growth and the expansion of God's kingdom. So, walking the tightrope of avoiding legalism and judgmentalism on the one hand, and avoiding throwing off sanctification and Christ-likeness and going soft on sin on the other. We have to walk that tightrope. And Scripture teaches that narrow is the path. Wide is the path that leads to destruction. Narrow is the path that we have to follow. It's not easy, but that's why we're called to go to the altar of grace regularly. And we're going to sing about that in a little bit. It's why we're called to feast on his word. It's why we're called to worship with abandon, like I talked about last Sunday, to seek his voice, to grow in our relational connection to God through the Spirit, to pray without ceasing, says Paul, to remain in the vine, John 15, connected to Jesus, to be in Christian community, to sharpen one another, to encourage and challenge each other. All of those spiritual disciplines and more that I haven't mentioned are not there just for people who like that kind of thing. No, they're not there just to be religious activities that, if we have a bit of time, we can kind of engage in. They're there because actually they're lifelines and vital connections we cannot live without. Or we're living in our own strength. So this morning, friends, if we, all of us, have lorded it over others, if your tendency is to look down on others, if you know you have a little bit of a holier-than-thou outlook, if you're a legalist in how you think, or if you've spent your spiritual life resisting the deep work of the Spirit, I don't want to go there because actually I like to harbor my own sin. I don't want to go there because actually I kind of like the lifestyle that I have, thanks very much. I don't want to let too much of Jesus in because he's going to ask me to change, and I don't want to. So if you're either one of those things, you are human, and it's okay. So let me encourage you, whatever it is this morning for you, you have the opportunity to come back to him and to get right and to seek his mercy. And we sang about that in the open. The readings were kind of about that. And we're going to sing a song called Come to the Altar. So I'll actually ask the team if they'll make their way back to the stage. As we sing this song, the invitation to you is to come to Jesus. The invitation is always to come to Jesus. And maybe you need to work some of those things out that you know are in you. And so you can take a posture if you like. You can get on your knees. You can stay seated. You can stand and worship. Whatever you want to do. You can come to the front to be prayed for after the service. But the invitation is to come. And Jesus is ready to grant you mercy, to give you a course correction, to love and bless you, to dust you off and send you on your way to do better. Amen.